Last week, we discussed how government policies can lead to inefficient market outcomes and deadweight loss. This week, we're going to talk about other characteristics that can lead markets to arrive at not efficient outcomes. So our first discussion of situations that can lead to inefficient outcomes are externalities. So really in this lecture, we're going to be asking a couple of main questions. What is an externality? Why do externalities make market outcomes inefficient? How can public policies solve externalities? And how can private markets, in some cases, also solve externality problems without any interference from the government? Okay, so what we're talking about here is a class of situations called market failures. And market failures are situations where competitive markets fail to arrive at an outcome that maximizes efficiency. So our first type of market failure that we're going to talk about are the presence of externalities. So externalities are really about private market transactions between two entities having an effect on a third party, so some bystander. So the effects of a private transaction on other people can be either good or bad. So you can think about a classic negative externality is pollution. So if I go purchase gasoline to put in my car and drive, that transaction where I purchase gasoline is just between me and the gas station. But then that gasoline I drive around, that gasoline gets turned into pollution, and other people around me suffer some adverse effects from me driving my car. And they had really no part to play in the transaction of me purchasing gasoline, but they are worse off because of that transaction. These effects can also be positive. So think about if I go and get vaccinated. When I choose to go get vaccinated, that's just a transaction between me and a doctor. But if I'm vaccinated, then let's say against the flu, then it's much less likely that I will contract the flu, and then also much less likely that I would give the flu to those around me. So those people around me get this benefit from me getting vaccinated, even though they are not party to the transaction. So in the presence of situations like this, public policies, actions by the government, can improve on market efficiency. So this is not about government policies making outcomes fairer, kind of like we talked about last week, where governments may want to help out buyers or sellers in a market, and that creates deadweight loss. Here we're talking about government policies that actually decrease deadweight loss, lead to more efficiency in the marketplace. Okay, so let's get started with discussing negative externalities first. And before we do that, I just want to go through a quick review of welfare economics, basically the supply and demand model. So here we're going to consider the market for gasoline. So if we look at our demand curve for gasoline, you can think of the demand curve as showing the private value that buyers place on purchasing the product. So the demand curve traces willingness to pay, the maximum amount that I'm willing to pay for a certain amount of gasoline. That is a measure of how much value I place and buyers as a whole place on gasoline for certain quantities. The supply curve, on the other hand, shows the private costs. So supply curve traces the willingness to sell. That's basically the lowest price that sellers would be willing to sell for a certain quantity of gasoline. That is the private cost. And before this lecture, we've basically been talking about situations where the costs and the benefits to society as a whole are basically just the private costs and the private benefits. So then we have our market equilibrium here where the supply and demand curves cross, and that is the equilibrium that maximizes consumer and producer surplus under this setup. But there's a problem with this situation here, and it's what I mentioned earlier. So I go purchase gasoline, and there's a cost to the gas station of producing and selling that gasoline. But there's also this additional cost that is borne by society. So when I purchase gasoline, I go drive around in my car, that produces pollution, and society as a whole bears some additional cost to that. So let's just say that that cost, to keep things simple, is $1 per gallon. So every gallon of gasoline that I burn generates $1 of negative, basically $1 of costs on society. So what we can do is modify our supply curve to also incorporate this social cost. So this social cost is going to be the total cost to society of a certain number of gallons of gasoline. And that's going to be the private cost, which is given by the supply curve, plus this external cost. So we said this external cost was $1 per gallon. So what we can do is draw this new curve, which is $1 higher than the supply curve. And this new line represents the total cost to society of gasoline. So again, it's the external cost plus that $1. That gives us the total cost to society of gasoline. Okay, so let's go back to what our market is doing here. And when we incorporate the social cost into our supply and demand model, now we see that the optimal quantity of gasoline that should be traded in the marketplace is actually 20 gallons, not 25 gallons. So just like before, any quantity that's less than 20 gallons, any quantity that's, let's say that there's 10 gallons that are traded in the marketplace, well, we're leaving benefits on the table. So if we traded 10 gallons here, then if we increase the quantity of gasoline we consumed, then the benefit to society, which is given by the demand curve, is still greater than the cost to society, which is given by the supply curve. So there are unexploited gains if we only consume 10 gallons of gasoline. The 20 gallon maximum, or the 20 gallon optimum rather, is again where the demand curve, which is giving us our benefit to society of consuming gasoline, crosses our social cost curve, which is giving us the total cost to society. So any time we consume more than 20 gallons, you can see any quantity further to the right than 20 gallons, the total cost to society is greater than the total benefit to society. So these are trades that should not happen. So if we just let the private market go, buyers of gasoline are going to follow their demand curve. Gas stations are going to follow their supply curve. We're going to get a total quantity traded of 25 here because neither sellers nor buyers take into account the external costs of their actions. So we'll get a quantity of 25 traded in the marketplace. That's where the private supply curve crosses the private demand curve. But this is more gasoline than is socially optimal to be traded. So we get deadweight loss, just like we had with taxes and price floors and price ceilings in the last week. So why is this deadweight loss here? Well, it's really for the same reasons. This trade here, the cost is higher than the benefit, so this is a trade that's generating a loss to society. So again, in this instance with negative externalities, if we just let markets go, we get a quantity traded that is too high to be socially optimal. What could we do to solve this? We're going to talk about this later in more detail, but one solution is you may notice that this looks a lot like the setup if we imposed a $1 tax on sellers. So we impose a $1 tax on sellers. That would shift the supply curve up by $1. And what's really important to notice here is that then the supply curve incorporating the tax would be exactly identical to the social cost curve. So this is an example of the general solution to externalities, which is getting the parties to a transaction to internalize the externality. So really what's going on here is that neither buyers nor sellers have an incentive to take account of the effects of their actions. So if we impose a $1 per gallon tax on sellers, then again that makes sellers incorporate the cost to society to their actions. So then if we get sellers or buyers to incorporate these costs, then basically we can let the free market go and our market will arrive at the social optimum again. And just a quick note too, it doesn't really matter again if we impose a $1 tax on buyers or sellers, because as we saw last week, whether you impose a tax on buyers or sellers, you reach the same outcome. All right, so how could we model positive externalities? So when we had negative externalities, we had an additional cost to society. So that was kind of a splitting between the supply curve and a curve that represented the total cost to society. With positive externalities, we have a benefit to society that isn't really recognized. So here what we have is the demand curve, which gives us kind of the private value to consumers in a market, but we have some external benefit as well. So again, you could think of vaccinations as giving an external benefit to people who are not engaged in the transaction. And what we're going to have is the socially optimal quantity is going to be where this social benefit curve, the benefit to society, is going to cross the supply curve. So how would this look like on the supply and demand diagram? Well, here's our demand curve, which gives the private benefits to people who are getting vaccinations. Here's the supply curve. This represents the costs to doctors and clinics for giving vaccinations. And if we just let the market go freely without accommodating or accounting for the positive externality rather, then we're going to reach this outcome. Okay, so the positive externality comes into play because again there are these benefits here which you can see as the vertical distance between the demand curve and the social benefit curve here. Every transaction, every vaccination, here's how much the consumers value the vaccination, and then there's this external benefit here to society which the buyers don't take into account. So really, here with positive externalities, too few vaccinations are happening in the market without some other force to intervene to push the market equilibrium out. So the socially optimal number of vaccinations is given by where the social benefit curve crosses the supply curve. So with negative externalities, private markets will generate too many transactions. Positive externalities, the private market will generate too few transactions. So here again, we have deadweight loss. If we just let the private market go, it's going to arrive at this quantity here, but you can see that if we increase vaccinations just a little bit more, the benefit to society is higher than the cost to society. So these are trades that would be welfare enhancing to society. These are trades that should happen, but they don't happen because buyers don't take into account the kind of external benefit to society of their actions. You're going to try and correct positive or negative externalities. There are kind of two general forms that policies could take. There are policies that are basically not based on prices, and these are called command and control policies. These are regulations, limits, requirements, etc., etc. And there are market-based policies. So since this is an economics class, unsurprisingly, we're going to advocate that market-based policies tend to work a lot better. So really what market-based policies are focused on is let's get parties to internalize the externality, whether it's positive or negative, and then just let the market go. So if we have pollution, we could think about taxing carbon. So one policy that economists are very much in favor of is taxing carbon. So you tax carbon, you set the tax equal to how much negative externalities each unit of carbon produces, and then you just let the market go. And just by doing that, we will produce the socially optimal amount of pollution. Everything will take care of itself. With positive externalities, you can basically think about a negative tax, which is known as a subsidy. So with a tax, you are taking money from people. Subsidy, you're giving money to people. One other policy that actually works the same as taxes, we're not going to go into depth into why it works the same, but you can use tradable permits. So basically, this is another way that you can try and limit the production of something that generates a negative externality, figure out how much of that good you want traded, and auction off permits to produce that good. And then let people trade these permits, and you will actually get almost exactly the same outcome as you would if you had levied a tax. Okay, so a little bit more in depth into these corrective taxes and subsidies. These are called Pigouvian taxes after a guy named Arthur Pigou. And what you do is you set the tax equal to the external cost. And if you have activities with positive externalities, then you set the subsidy equal to the external benefit. And if you do that, then you just let the market go, and the market will arrive at the efficient outcome. So why are these better than regulations? Well, let's think about pollution. So let's think about specifically coal power plants. So some coal power plants are old, some are new. And some power plants, it would be easier for those power plants, cheaper for them to reduce the amount of carbon emissions and pollution they produce. So really what we want here is we want an efficient quantity of pollution. So we want a certain quantity of pollution. And what economists would say is we want to get to this efficient quantity of pollution and at the same time impose as little cost to society as possible. And what we can see is a pollution tax is the most efficient way to do this. So it is the way that will get us to the efficient quantity of pollution with the least harm to society. So if we tax pollution, then firms for who it is really cheap to reduce pollution, they'll reduce their pollution. And firms for who it's not really very easy for them to reduce their pollution, they will bear the burden of the tax. So if we just regulated that all firms reduce their pollution, then, well, that would be a more expensive policy to arrive to the exact same level of pollution than just imposing a tax. And you can think about other benefits to imposing a tax too. If we start to tax things which we want less of, like pollution, drinking, smoking, etc., then maybe we can reduce taxes on the things that we actually like, such as income, Okay, so can come up with this nice little summary of externalities. So negative externalities are costs borne by third parties to transactions. Positive externalities are benefits received by third parties. So negative externalities, think about pollution. Traffic congestion is a classic example too. Noise pollution. Positive externalities examples are flu shots, education. So you all, by going to college, are going to become better citizens, more informed, more productive, better neighbors, all of those things. People who have really nice lawns, etc. All these things are positive externalities. If we want to correct negative externalities, economists would suggest taxes or cap and trade. If you want to correct for positive externalities, economists would suggest subsidies. Okay, so there are some situations where private markets will arrive at solutions to externalities, and this is called the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem states that if you have basically a very small number of private parties and they can very easily bargain over the allocated resources, then they solve the externalities problem on their own. So let's think of an example here with the Coase theorem. So we've got our guy Dick who owns a dog named Spot. And there's a negative externality because Spot barks, and that disturbs Jane, who lives next to Dick. So if we're looking at the socially efficient outcome, that's the outcome that's going to maximize both these people's well-being. So if Dick values having Spot more than Jane values peace and quiet, then the dog should stay. If Jane values peace and quiet more than Dick values having Spot, then the dog should go. So what the Coase theorem says is that basically Dick and Jane will bargain over whether Spot should stay or go. And as long as we assign a right to either Dick or Jane, then they can bargain over this right. So we could assign Dick the right to keep his dog, or we could assign Jane the right to peace and quiet. So let's see how this would work. So let's say that Dick has a benefit of $500 of keeping his dog, and Jane, it cost her $800 to listen to Spot barking. So the socially efficient outcome should be that the dog goes. So let's say that Dick has the right to keep the dog. Well, what's going to happen? Well, Jane would pay Dick somewhere between $501 and $799 and to get rid of Spot. And Dick would say, okay, well, I only value keeping Spot at $500, so if you're going to pay me more than that, then okay, I'll get rid of the dog. So they're going to bargain, Spot's going to go bye-bye, and the private outcome that these two people would reach is the same as the efficient outcome. So what if we switched this around and gave Jane the legal right to peace and quiet? So again, we have the same benefit to Dick of keeping his dog, same cost to Jane of hearing Spot's barking. So the efficient outcome is Spot should go bye-bye because the cost to Jane is higher than the benefit to Dick. So what would happen here is, well, Jane has the right to peace and quiet, so she basically gets to determine whether Spot stays or goes. And Dick would say, well, I'll give you a maximum of $500 to let me keep Spot. Jane would say, no, I really hate his barking more than that. So Spot would go bye-bye. So here again, the private outcome is the same as the efficient outcome. All right, so what if we switch this around just a little bit, go back to kind of a situation similar to the first one. Dick has the right to keep his dog, but now Dick really loves Spot. So maybe Spot learned how to fetch, so now the benefit to Dick of having Spot is $1,000, and the cost to Jane of hearing Spot's barking is $800. So the socially efficient outcome is now for the dog to stay. So Jane's not willing to pay more than $800. Dick is not willing to accept less than $1,000, so the dog stays. And here again, the private outcome is the same as the efficient outcome. All right, so this is all well and good, but this is the Coase theorem, while a very powerful idea, doesn't usually work in practice. So here's why. Well, the first thing is transaction costs. So it's almost never the case that parties can costlessly bargain. So there are some transaction costs to people bargaining over an externality. So anytime you have transactions costs, that can basically get in the way of people costlessly bargaining, and people can also be stubborn. So it's not always the case that people will agree to something that might be in their and other people's best interests. I'm sure you all know people who are annoyingly stubborn. And kind of similar to transactions costs, if we get a large number of people, it's very hard to coordinate all of these people together. So in these situations, it may be easier to just impose a tax on negative externalities or impose a subsidy on positive externalities. Okay, in the next lecture, we will talk about other market failures, public goods, common resources, and characteristics of goods that would lead them to be public goods or common resources.